The Friends of Farm Foundation program can help you further expand your network with a diverse group of food and agriculture leaders. Entry-level benefits include virtual networking sessions, while contributions at the upper levels unlock additional benefits, such as a personalized tour of our new Innovation and Education campus. Help us celebrate 90 years of making a positive impact on the future of agriculture. Visit farmfoundation.org to explore the benefits of becoming a friend and supporter of Farm Foundation today.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our Farm Foundation Forum, Ownership and Investment in U.S. Farmland. We are glad to have the opportunity to engage with you and are thankful to Farm Credit for their support of this forum. My name is Martha King, and I am the Vice President of Programs and Projects at Farm Foundation, located just outside of Chicago, Illinois. I'm looking forward to today's discussion, which will explore the challenges and opportunities surrounding agricultural land ownership in the U.S. Before we get into today's program, I'm going to take just a few moments to share a little bit more about Farm Foundation. We are a 501c3 nonprofit working at the intersection of agriculture and society to address challenges that affect the entire food and ag value chain. Specifically, we are an accelerator of practical solutions for agriculture, accelerating people and ideas into action. This year, we are celebrating 90 years of doing this work. The three levers we use to accomplish our work are policy, innovation, and education. Forums such as today's are just one part of our extensive program of work, which is guided by our mission to build trust and understanding at the intersection of agriculture and society, and our vision to build a future for farmers, our communities, and our world. We rely on partnerships to fund our work and increase our impact. So if you're interested in learning more about funding or partnering with us, I invite you to reach out to explore collaboration. Now, I'd like to take a minute to highlight our Friends of Farm Foundation program. With your enrollment as a friend, you will not only be helping to support the mission and vision of Farm Foundation, but you will also gain exclusive benefits such as first reads of our issue reports, networking opportunities, and much more. Being a friend is an investment in building a better future for farmers, our communities, and our world. To learn more about being a friend of Farm Foundation, go to farmfoundation.org/friends, and a link is also being posted in the chat. In addition to learning more about Farm Foundation and our work by visiting our website, I encourage you to connect with us on our social media platforms. If you are posting on social media about this morning's session, we ask that you please use #FarmFoundationForum. And I'd like to share now a few last housekeeping notes. There will be an audience question and answer session at the end. We'll be using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and not the chat to queue questions. This forum is being recorded and will be posted on our website at farmfoundation.org, as well as on our YouTube channel. We'll send out that link following today's program. When the forum concludes, you will receive a link to a brief survey. Farm Foundation appreciates your feedback and your time in completing the survey. Now let's turn to today's forum topic, ownership and investment in U.S. farmland. Today's outstanding panel will provide a diversity of expertise on this topic, discussing historical issues with agricultural land ownership, trends in farm demographic change, competition for land between farmers and ranchers, real estate and energy development interests, and more. We look forward to their insights. It's my pleasure to introduce as our moderator and discussion leader, David Haight. David is Vice President for Programs with American Farmland Trust. He is responsible for leading AFT's regional programs that operate in 25 states, along with national farm viability programs, including AFT's Brighter Future Fund and Smart Solar program. He previously served as the New York director, where he led collaborative efforts to permanently protect 100,000 acres of farmland, help farmers protect soil and water in the Long Island Sound and Great Lakes watersheds, scale up sales of local food to institutions, and bring a new generation of farmers to the land. David's wife, Suzanne, is a farmer who sells flowers and offers gardenscape services in New York, Saratoga region. Thank you for moderating our forum today, David.
Martha, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today for this important conversation about ownership and investment in U.S. farmland. This is just a really important and timely conversation. Next slide, please. So for those of you that don't know the American Farmland Trust, we're a 40-year-old national organization that was created to help launch a national movement to protect farmland from real estate development, promote sound farming practices, and keep farmers on the land. Today, we have nearly 200 staff, as I like to say, working from the kitchen table to the Congress to advance that cause. So today's conversation is absolutely in our wheelhouse. As moderator, I want to try to help set the table a little bit for today's conversation. We'll give a brief overview of agricultural land in America and some of the trends that are shaping ownership and investment, and then very much looking forward to digging in with our three panelists, Howard, Eloris, and Whitney. Next slide. One of the important elements of this conversation is just understanding how significant the concentration of agricultural land is in the United States. The American Farmland Trust and the Natural Resources Conservation Service have collaborated on a series of studies of agricultural land in America. The map that you see in front of you is an outgrowth of one of our most recent collaborations called Farms Under Threat. The United States has roughly 940 million acres of land in private land ownership associated with agriculture. Cropland, pasture land, rangeland, woodland. Additionally, there is roughly 215 million acres of public land associated with agricultural use, principally grazing land on federally owned land in the Western United States. This is both a diverse landscape. It is also globally significant. There were a few other countries around the world that have the type of natural asset that exists in the United States. Next slide. There are a number of phenomena that are impacting agricultural land ownership and investment in this country. I want to highlight a couple of them. First is changes that are happening in the farming and ranching community. Particularly change in intergenerational transfers of farm and ranches. According to the 2017 Census of Agriculture, there were 4 times more senior farmers in this country than young farmers, and 40% of those senior operators did not identify a young farmer being involved in the ownership and or management of their farm. This is significant because farms that are at a time of transfer are vulnerable for many of these families. They're going to have to look outside the family for that next generation. Certainly for some, this is a time when they can be lost to real estate development. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of acres. Senior farmers and landowners in this country own 370 million acres of agricultural land. So you could imagine in the next 20 years, there will literally be hundreds of millions of acres changing hands. Next slide. At the same time, research from the United States Department of Agriculture, the American Farmland Trust, Farm Bureau, many others have identified barriers for beginning farmers and ranchers. One of the biggest being accessing land. It's hard to identify land that's available and is suited for the type of enterprise you might want to launch, being able to afford the price of land because of competition, or if leased land is available, being able to have lease terms that offer the type of security that a beginning farmer or rancher might need to be successful. So this transfer of farms from one generation to the next will literally reshape how hundreds of millions of acres are owned in this country. Next slide. There's also a significant amount of land in this country that is owned by non-farmers and rented to farmers. The map that you see here is from the 2017 Census of Agriculture. It identifies the amount of rented land by county across the country. Overall, roughly 40% of the agricultural land in America is owned by non-farmers. This includes individuals like former farmers, family members of farmers, people that just bought land as individuals for different reasons, as well as institutional buyers. And this is an area that Howard has incredible expertise in. And so Howard is going to be speaking more about these issues and how they impact agriculture across the country. Next slide. Certainly, it's not just the non-farmers that want to own land for and then rent it for agricultural purposes. There's also other non-farm buyers, people that want to own agricultural land and convert it to other uses. The American Farmland Trust released a report last year called Farms Under Threat 2040. It projects that roughly 18 million acres of agricultural land across this country is going to be fragmented, developed, paved over by 2040. This is not going to be spread equally around the country. It's particularly concentrated in states like Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, other parts of the Southeast. So this competition for land with other potential buyers is going to be a significant force that is going to be shaping land ownership patterns in the future. Next slide. It's not just people that want to buy or lease land for development of for real estate purposes, but it's also solar energy and renewable energy that's going to have an impact on our landscape. Solar energy in particular, because the significant influence it's going to have on the landscape. The US Department of Energy, the chart that's here in front of you, suggests that if we're going to decarbonize our electricity grid and all of our energy supplies, that it is going to require potentially 8 to 10 million acres of solar energy be built across the country. At the American Farmland Trust, we talk about the importance of the need for smart solar, prioritizing solar energy being built on land that is not as well suited for farming. If it is going to be built on agricultural land that is suitable for production, that steps be taken to safeguard the soil, as well as to promote opportunities for the emerging field of agrovoltaics, where you co-locate solar energy production and agricultural production on the same property. But no doubt, solar energy, real estate development are a major force in shaping land ownership and investment trends across the country. Next slide. Lastly, I just want to identify that agriculture and land ownership in this country are both a powerful and a challenging legacy. That for some families, they've had land in the family for literally hundreds of years. And that is a powerful testimony to hard work, to sacrifice, shared purpose. There are other families that have had land taken from them. They've been prevented from having access to opportunities, to resources, and they are looking to regain or maintain ownership of land and rebuild connections with agricultural land. So very happy that Eloris is here. She's going to be speaking about the challenges and needs of socially disadvantaged farmers, particularly Black farmers. And Whitney is here as well. And Whitney is going to be bringing an important perspective from the Native American community. Last slide, please. So very much looking forward to this important conversation about ownership and investment in US farmland today. Certainly land is a fundamental asset for farm viability in our agricultural economy. It's vital to our food production, our energy supplies. It influences land stewardship and things like water quality and our ability to be resilient to severe weather and climate change. And fundamentally, this land has helped define our nation for generations. So this is an important conversation. It's a timely one, and very much looking forward to digging in with our speakers today. So let me start our conversation by introducing our first speaker, Howard Halderman. Howard is the president of Halderman Farm Management, Halderman Real Estate Services, and executive chair of U.S. Agriculture. He is accountable for overseeing the day-to-day operations of the Halderman companies, U.S. Agriculture, and developing the strategic direction of the firms. The Halderman companies oversee farmland assets for over 1,100 clients in 22 states, totaling 250,000 acres. They also buy and sell via private treaty and at auction more than $250 million of farmland in the Midwest and perform over 1,200 appraisals of farmland annually. U.S. Agriculture has over $500 million in agricultural assets under management. Howard, thank you very much for getting our conversation started.
David, thank you. I really appreciate the introduction, and I think you've set the table well for this discussion. I've got here on the first slide, who owns or buys the land? And I think David made a great point. 40% of the farm real estate in the United States is owned by somebody who doesn't farm it themselves. those are the clients the Halderman companies serve for the most part. We represent a lot of individual landowners. We represent some institutional farm landowners. And I would argue that they are an important component to United States agriculture in terms of the capital stack and land ownership. As we think about farmers today, many of the farmers that we work with own, and think about this, if you farm 5,000 row crop acres, you're a fairly significant farm operator. You might own 20% of that. That's 1,000 acres. Here in Indiana, 1,000 acres is $15 million. That's a lot of money in today's world. So it is tough to own all of the land you may wish to farm with the equipment and the technology that's available today. And so leasing land has been a method of acquiring additional assets to have in your portfolio. And that's been in place for generations and decades and centuries. So I would argue that the absentee land ownership is an important part of the capital stack when you think about how U.S. agriculture gets done. It's a horribly intensive capital investment, not just the land, but also farmland equipment, putting talent in place. All of those are very expensive propositions. So when you can diversify some of that and spread the land ownership amongst individuals who maybe grew up on the farm, inherited the farm, don't farm it themselves, but still want to keep it, or you're diversifying it by owning or farming land, leasing land from an institutional investor who's seeking a certain type of return. I think that's really critical to how U.S. agriculture goes forward. So we'll start there. If you go to the next slide. So when we think about farmland, and these are dollar amounts, these aren't acres. David talked a lot about acres. I'm going to talk a little bit about dollar amounts to start out. But you can see I've got a map here of the United States. It's a little small, but these slides will be available, I believe, after the event if you want to dig in deeper to this. We break the country up into various regions. And there's $3.4 trillion in U.S. farm real estate. Of that, $1.9 trillion is cropland, that permanent and row. And out of that 1.9, you shrink that funnel down a little bit further, the 1.2 trillion is cropland in non-prohibited states. And you'd say, well, Howard, why is there a difference? Well, we represent absentee landowners and investment landowners who wish to acquire farmland. And if you look down the middle part of the country in the map, you'll see some states with white hatched lines. Those are states that today have some form of foreign ownership restriction. Sometimes it's foreign ownership foreign to the United States. Some of the restrictions are foreign to that state. So for example, if you want to own land in the state of Missouri, I, as an individual living in Indiana, can do that. But my Indiana-based company or Indiana-based LLC cannot own land in the state of Missouri. That's state law. So every state has a little different variation to that has those hatched lines. But when we think about the investment universe, there's about $700 billion of cropland that's kind of locked away a little bit in those states that are prohibited to foreign ownership. And then you go down a little bit further, we look at water accessible cropland in the non-prohibited states. So where can we actually access water, either by natural rainfall or irrigation? That's about $1 trillion. And then out of that 1 trillion, there's only about 20 billion that sells each year. So I kind of thought this was helpful to put some metrics around when you think about farmland investment and what's actually available each and every year. So now let's go to the next slide, because one of the questions I've received throughout the winter, and I think, Morgan, you're going to kind of have to key through some of these, but I went back, looked at foreign ownership of U.S. farmland, because all winter I did these seminars on farmland values, and every single seminar I got the question, well, Howard, how much land do the Chinese own? So let's look at that. So Morgan hit the key again. There's 40 million acres of farmland. Now, this is forest land included, so I kind of break that down there. 40 million acres total owned by foreign to the United States entities. As a comparison, the state of Illinois has 37 million acres total. So it's significant, right? 50% roughly of that 40 million acres is forest land, timberland. So, okay, that's not necessarily surprising, I don't think. But that 40 million acres represents 3.1% of all farmland. All right, 3.1%, not as significant as what we might originally think. And out of that 3.1%, Chinese ownership is only 1% of the total foreign owned. So that was one that came out in the study that I picked out in December 31 of 2021, the Chinese ownership. They didn't break it down by others. Certainly most of the foreign ownership here in the United States is going to be Western EU, Australian, South American. Those are the most of the landowners that we see that are foreign to the US. Or you might hit the next key. I think there's another, go back a slide, I'm sorry. So on that topic, the debate is then, well, should we restrict foreign ownership? And that is a debate taking place in Congress right now. In fact, Pro-Farmer, and I'll give credit to Pro-Farmer, on Friday, their publication talked about a bipartisan bill. It's called Protecting U.S. Farmland and Sensitive Sites from Foreign Adversaries Act. And that would expand the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. So would allow the U.S. food security to include review of land purchases by foreign entities. So even at the federal level, there are bills being offered up that would restrict foreign ownership. I know Indiana, for example, passed a law about a year ago. It was signed into legislation that eliminated any foreign ownership of Indiana cropland in the state, any foreign ownership. I look at that as being a little bit troubling because, hey, Halderman has clients from the UK, Germany, and Denmark who want to buy land here. So you're restricting our business with some groups that I think would be positive to have a relationship with here in the state of Indiana. Now, they did offer a loophole, and the loophole was, but if you're invested in livestock, you can own as many acres as you wish. Okay, who owns Smithfield Foods? Big livestock company, Chinese owned. So I just bring this up as an example. It was legislation that I had a state representative tell me it was kind of a rah-rah bill passed that was anti-Russia, anti-Chinese. And I get that. I understand the sentiment behind that. But I think there might be better ways of handling foreign ownership as we discuss these bills at the federal level. So next slide, please. So I get this question, how much are the Chinese buying? Well, I can tell you in my career, 35 years of doing this, we have never sold any farmland in Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, Michigan, never to any Chinese interest, no Russian interests. Yes, we have sold some to Western European and South American interests. That's the extent of it. Generally speaking, though, who buys farmland today? And this slide shows our actual sales results. The blue part of the bar is the farmer buyer. So that's somebody who actually is driving tractors, planting a crop, harvesting a crop each year. The farmland investor, those would be individuals, a majority of them, or some institutional investors that are pension funds, endowments, and the like. So you can see in here in 2023, it's 65% farmer buyers. And throughout history, it tends to be a majority farmer buyers. And now we're in the Eastern Corn Belt. We do have a lot of farm investors that have interest in owning land. So it doesn't surprise me that we see some of the numbers that are 40, 50%. But generally speaking, it's the farmer buyer. And I think if you look across all transactions, you're probably going to see that inch up towards 70% of all farmland sales in the Corn Belt are going to go to a farmer buyer. Next slide, please. And this just gets into a little bit of discussion of Halderman sales and the marketplace today. I only want to point this out because you think about investors and what they're seeking in terms of return. And the farmland market dramatically changed in 2021. This slide shows it the best, where you can see we went through multiple quarters. We hit July of 2021, and that's where we jumped. This is a metric that gets into so many dollars per bushel of productivity index of soils, and it jumped quite dramatically, 40% increase almost overnight, and it has continued to trend higher. This starts to knock a lot of those investors out of the marketplace today. cash returns on farmland are probably in the 2.5% net cash return. You can buy CDs at 5% today. So comparable investments start to become more competitive. So while we think about who's buying the farmland, the farmer is the majority buyer this year, because the majority of the time they're adding assets in the area where they've always farmed. It's the farm down the road. It's the one chance in their lifetime to own that farm. So they will seek to own it if they can, and probably accept a lower rate of return because of that. Last two slides I'll hit on real quickly here. This is, does quality matter? Sometimes people say, well, better quality farms sell for more money. That is in fact true based upon our data from 2021 through 2023. The better quality farms are on the right-hand side of this graph, lower quality on the left. And then the size matter, and that's the last slide. And you can see here that generally smaller parcels sell for more dollars per acre, or more dollars per soil productivity index in this case. That's usually the thought most of us have, and as we did the analysis, that proves it as well. So I think, Morgan, that was my last slide. Yeah, you've got my email and phone number here if anyone wants to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions later.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Howard. And as Martha mentioned in the chat, we really look forward to getting questions throughout the conversation here today. So please use that question and answer function that's at the bottom of your screen. And we're going to dig into the Q&A with Howard and with our other speakers, Eloris and Whitney, here in a few minutes. So let me introduce our next speaker, Eloris Speight. Eloris is the director of the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Research Center at Alcorn State University. She leads the Policy Center in conducting research on policy impacting socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers and making policy recommendations that will improve their success. The Policy Center played a key role in advocating for items that were included in the 2018 Farm Bill. Previously, Eloris had a 10-year career at the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resources Conservation Service, serving as a member of the NRCS Executive Leadership Team and as a policy advisor, and was the first Black female to hold the position of Deputy Administrator in the 80-plus year history of the agency. Eloris also had a 20-year career at Fannie Mae. Thank you very much for joining us today, Eloris.
Thank you, David. I'm delighted to be here. So the Socially Disadvantaged Farmers and Ranchers Policy Research Center, which we refer to as a Policy Center because it is a mouthful, was authorized in 2014 Farm Bill. The Farm Bill stated it was to be housed at an 1890 university. And so Alcorn State University was the successful grantee. Now it is, next slide, please. It is a national center. So although it is located at Alcorn in Lorman, Mississippi, we represent farmers throughout the United States with the strategic focus in the 18 states with 1890 land-grant universities. The Policy Center is staffed by 6 full-time employees, and the majority of our work gets done through contracts and subawards. The Policy Center was created to be a voice for socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, and to ensure that there was data-driven information available. So the Policy Center actually provides a vehicle for minority farmers to be involved in policy construction, interpretation, and implementation. All right, next. Now, it is housed within the Office of the President. So I report to the President of Alcorn State University, and I have a dotted line to the Director of Agriculture. Next. So the mission of the Policy Center then is to conduct research, analyze policy, and make recommendations seeking to achieve equitable, and I'm going to underscore equitable, and economic integration of USDA programs and policies for socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, communities, and rural landowners. Now, our vision is to be the premier authority for information on the history, current conditions, trends, and future projections of socially disadvantaged farmers, ranchers, and communities. Next. And I mentioned underscoring equity and versus equality, if you will, because there is a difference there, if you can see in the picture. So equitable and equal are two different words with different meanings. Equitable means marked by or having equity and applies in the context of fairness or equal treatment. Equal means the same in all respects and refers to any two things which are the same. So again, the equitable integration is what we are seeking, and equity recognizes that each person has different circumstances and allocates the exact resources and opportunities needed to reach an equitable outcome. Next, so at the Policy Center, we have 4 primary areas of focus: stakeholder engagement, active research, policy development, and strategic outreach. All right, within stakeholder engagement, so the Policy Center is inclusive in that we are currently working with over 70 plus community-based organizations that represent socially disadvantaged farmers, 100% of the 1890 community, and we also work with a number of 1862 universities that share in our common goals and objectives. We have a technical working group consisting of land grant staff and USDA staff, because we want to make sure when we put policy recommendations forward, they are technically accurate. We take our recommendations through the Congressional Black Caucus, and we also have an advisory board that is chaired by the president of Alcorn State University and includes 24 members that represent a diverse spectrum of the farming community. Okay, we also have, and I won't name all of them, but I have them, available, a list of partnerships. We continue to expand the partners that we work with, including several law centers there, to make sure, once again, that we have accurate policy. We have a number of policy organizations, the land grant community. Within USDA, we have specific partners, Tougaloo College for the leadership of elected officials. In agribusiness, we work closely with John Deere and Cativa AgriScience, and most recently, the International Produce Association and Walmart Center for Racial Equity. So our second area of priority is research. And here we focus on policy research that impacts socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. Now, our research studies are available on our website. But we have 6 primary areas of focus: the impact of agricultural policy on socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers, participation in USDA programs by socially disadvantaged farmers, either those things that support or hinder participation, access to and use of, and we started with technology. We have expanded that to other resources, capital being one of the primary resources, and then land loss among African-American or Black farmers. And this is the only one where we focus specifically on Black farmers, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. We later on added 2 additional priorities: youth programs and pipeline, and community and urban agriculture. Now, the third area of concentration or focus for us is actually policy development. And so what I want to touch on that's relevant today for today's discussion is the Justice for Black Farmers Act, and just provide a little bit of background. So from 1868 to 1934, the federal government gave away 246 million acres of farmland and 160-acre land grants to over 1.5 million white families. So these federal land grants became the source of wealth creations for millions of white Americans as they improved the land, engaged in agricultural production, and leveraged the asset to start businesses and make investments. Couple that with, over the past 100 years, white farmers have also utilized USDA loans, subsidy programs, and grants to expand their operations and weather difficult times. Now, during the same period, Black farmers were often denied this assistance through a long history of racist discrimination by USDA. Now, when Black farmers tried to speak out about these injustices, USDA systematically ignored or dismissed their claims. So this systemic racism by the federal government, coupled with market discrimination, forced the disposition of millions of acres of Black farmland and decimated the population of Black farmers in America. So in 1920, there were nearly 1 million Black farmers in the United States. And this is during this time period, Blacks in the US made up 14% of the population, and they were also 14% of the farm population. There were 926,000 out of total of 6,425,400 Black operated farms, or 1/7, which was 14% of all farm operations. So Black farmers have declined by more than 96% since 1920, and is the only group that is declining in numbers there. So why the focus on Black farmers? I mentioned that we represent all socially disadvantaged farmers, but the focus on Black farmers because now, a century later, there are fewer than 50,000 Black farmers in the US. They represent 1.4% of the 2.8 million farmers and ranchers in the US. So today, Blacks still make up 14% of the US population, but only 1.4% of the farm population. There are 35,470, and this was from the 2017 census, out of a total 2,042,220 Black operated farms, or 1.7% of all farm operations. So the Black owned farms that remain are smaller on average than other farms, and Black farmers make a fraction of what white farmers make in farm income. And according to USDA, 8% of Black farmers receive their funding from federal sources, if you will, or USDA. And so our focus is because without some intervention, Black farmers will become extinct. Now, so what has been done? So the efforts of 32 Black groups to work with 4 candidates during the previous election, and specifically they worked with Senators Warren, Senators Sanders, then Vice President Biden, and Michael Bloomberg. Now, Senator Warren developed the most comprehensive policy and then drafted what has now become known as the Justice for Black Farmers Act. Senator Booker later took the lead in pushing this act forward, and then Senator Reverend Warnock drafted the American Relief for Farmers of Color Act in February of 2021 to try to help. So the Justice for Black Farmers Act was an attempt to create economic justice by eliminating lingering federal discrimination, by creating fair access to credit and federal programs and to provide the tools to grow the dream into a reality. The bill would have put in place market reforms and invest substantially in regenerative agriculture to help level the playing field. And so, again, the bill was an attempt to provide Black Americans and other Americans of color the same opportunity that has been provided to white America. So one of the things, so next slide, please. So what we have done at the Policy Center, we have advanced a number of recommendations to the House and Senate Agricultural Committees. And in the interest of time, so that the categories, if you will, relate to racial equity, specifically justice for Black farmers, use of the terms, both socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. There is really no shared cultural history among the racial and ethnic groups. There are recommendations related to the farm FSA, county and state committees, access to credit and other resources specifically related to the farm credit system, and transparency and accountability for both USDA and the farm credit system. We have recommendations related to the disparities in funding between 1890 universities and the 1862 universities, and then related to expanding urban and youth agriculture. There, next. The Inflation Reduction Act, and again, I won't go into that, but there were certain highlights of that act that were intended then to level the playing fields in some cases. And there were specifically $2.2 billion for discrimination of financial assistance and $3.1 billion then for distressed borrowers. And USDA had a fact sheet on the Inflation Reduction Act, again, which I won't go into the details there. But next, so the fourth area of priority for the Policy Center is strategic outreach. Then, and the only thing I want to say here, one thing. So one of the things that we do at the Policy Center is provide technical assistance and education, if you will. So we facilitate education. And what we found in the land loss, then I didn't mention that, the top reasons then for land loss among Black farmers, in addition to the discriminatory practices, was farm disagreement, partition sales, lack of probate or estate planning, tax sales, retirement, or death. And these contributed to heirs property. So there is a disproportionate number of Black farmers that have heirs property. So anyway, in terms of, what can be done, strategic outreach. So we facilitate education in some of those very subjects: farm management, farm bill policy development, financial, tax, business, marketing, planning, cooperative development, and specifically related to heirs property. We have an agreement at the Policy Center with FSA, USDA. And what we're doing is working with a number of organizations to develop train-the-trainer programs, if you will, for land grant extension staff so that they can provide the direct training related to heirs property across the United States. And we developed a curriculum and basically give them a plug and play model there. And we provide a number of tools as well. So next, outreach. What we have started doing as well, we produce a quarterly newsletter and then podcasts and webinars for policy education and updates. known as the Policy Center Live. Okay. And so I'm going to stop here in the interest of time, but my contact information. So in addition to myself at the Policy Center, there is a management analyst, there is a policy analyst that coordinates all of our policy. We have a research analyst on staff, and most recently, we added a communication specialist that manages our social media. And then we have a program coordinator. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, David. Thank you.
Fantastic, Eloris. Thank you so much. Really appreciate all that you just shared with us. Our last speaker today is going to be Whitney Sawney. Whitney is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation and is the Director of Communications and Policy for the Native American Agriculture Fund. Previous to this role, Whitney served as a communications manager for the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative at the University of Arkansas, and also as a communications associate for the National Congress of American Indians. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Arkansas. In the year after graduating, she interned for former Senate Minority Leader Harry Reid, completed the Native American Political Leadership Program at George Washington University, and was awarded the Wilma P. Mankiller Fellowship with the National Congress of American Indians in Washington, D.C. Whitney, thank you so much for joining us here today, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I appreciate that. Thank you for the Farm Foundation for having us as a part of this important discussion. I'm thrilled to be here with our other panelists and part of this forum and this discussion. So I just want to go into a little bit of background information about who we are at the Native American Agriculture Fund, or NAF, as I will shorten it to, just because it is a lot of words bundled together there. But you can go into the next slide. So NAF is the largest philanthropic organization devoted solely to serving Native American farming and ranching communities. And on this next slide, we'll go into a little bit more background about how we were founded. So we are a private funding entity. We are a drawdown trust fund, and we are derived from the Cypre funds that came from the class action litigation Keeps Eagle v. Vilsack, which were claims based on Native American farmers and ranchers that lacked access to credit and credit servicing. We were officially founded in 2018, and since that time, we have provided more than $70 million in grant making and investments focused on business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, and advocacy services. So our work is governed by a trust agreement, and that trust agreement states who we can fund and who our eligible entity types are. And that includes nonprofits, educational institutions, community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and then tribes, both state and federally recognized. So we're focused on healthy lands, healthy people, and healthy economies, ultimately investing in work to find solutions to the challenges that Native American farmers and ranchers face, and increasing access to capital for Native producers, because that's why we exist. That's how we came to be. And so part of that, impacts areas such as improving food access and increasing food security, diversifying economic development through agriculture in tribal and rural communities, but also investing in agricultural efforts that support tribal food systems. So when we're talking about this important discussion of investing in farmland and land ownership, it's important to discuss first the historical issues that Native Americans face when it comes to land ownership and inadequate access to agricultural land. So I want to take a quick overarching look at the Dawes Act, or the General Allotment Act of 1887. Eloris went into some of this time period for some of the producers during this time were socially disadvantaged farmers, but the Dawes Act was specifically aimed to assimilate Native Americans by breaking up tribal land holdings and assigning allotments to individual plots of land to Native American families. So under that act, communal land was divided and distributed among those individual tribal members, and then the remaining land, or surplus land, was often sold to non-natives. And that had several detrimental effects on land ownership and agriculture in Indian country. It disrupted the traditional communal land tenure systems, which were central to Native American cultures and sustainable agricultural practices. And that division of land into individual allotments often resulted in fragmented and inadequate plots that were unsuitable for sustaining those traditional agricultural practices. And then you also have the Burke Act, which further exacerbated some of those issues caused by the Dawes Act, which allowing the federal government to classify Native American allotment recipients as either competent or incompetent based on their perceived ability to manage their land and resources. So those deemed incompetent had their land placed under federal control and land often sold to non-Native individuals. There are currently over 56 million acres of land held in trust by the federal government. There are some protections that come with that, but at the same time, from these different acts that were enacted, there were severe consequences leading to loss of land, undermining the ability of Native people to engage in agriculture, which is wild considering Native Americans were the original stewards of this land and have been cultivating it for generations. So this ultimately resulted in further fragmentation and loss of tribal land overall. So when we're talking about what's happening now, it's important to also understand the role of tribal sovereignty in land management, or the authority of tribes to govern and control their own food production and agricultural resources. This includes establishing different tribal 638 authorities or self-determination for tribes establishing their own agricultural resource management plans, where tribes can define how they want their agricultural resources managed, or even establishing their own tribal agricultural departments to help also manage those resources and support and meet the needs of their community. So it also comes back, I'm just going to go back one more slide if you don't mind. When it comes to self-governance, tribal nations have the right to make decisions and develop policies regarding their own food and agricultural systems, as I said. This also includes the ability to create their own laws and regulations and institutions that reflect the needs of the tribal producers. And I'll go into a little bit later on in my presentation about who's doing that work to support that ability. Also, it includes, tribal sovereignty acknowledgement of a tribe's authority to manage and utilize their lands, their waters, and their natural resources. It includes cultural preservation, and tribal food and agricultural systems are deeply tied to indigenous cultures and traditions. And tribal sovereignty allows the tribes to maintain and revive those traditional knowledge and farming techniques and food practices and food system development that have sustained tribal communities for generations. It's also, an opportunity to generate economic opportunities through food and agricultural enterprises. Developing these agricultural economies, tribes are often the backbone of our economies, and in some states are even the top employer that contributes significantly to our economies. And then also tribal sovereignty's role in recognizing the importance of ensuring food security and nutrition and wellness within tribal communities to address those issues such as food deserts or access to healthy and culturally appropriate foods. So efforts to strengthen tribal sovereignty overall in terms of tribal food and agricultural systems includes upholding those treaty responsibilities and working with those sovereign governments through various policy and farm bill provisions, different land repatriation efforts, different capital investments that empower the tribes and tribal producers to really sustain their agricultural production. I also want to talk a little bit about preservation of traditional agricultural practices. In order to have the healthy and sustainable foodways, we must take care of that land. Indigenous people were the original stewards of this land. They've been cultivating it for generations. They took care of forests, managed soil health, preserved water, and that generational knowledge of the connection between land and food systems isn't new. It's been practiced through generations to heal and protect tribal foodways and feed and sustain Indigenous people. They have successfully maintained that harmonious relationship with the land and the environments for millennia to ensure the long-term health and resilience of their food systems. But there are still challenges and different complex legal frameworks and barriers to accessing capital that many Native American farmers and ranchers face. When it comes to having and operating on tribal lands, there's often complex ownership arrangements that can make it difficult to secure loans or use land as collateral for those different legal, due to those different legal complexities and limitations. Tribal lands can be held in trust by the federal government, which can make tribal land leasing subject to those complex regulations and make that process for leasing really lengthy or difficult to navigate. That can ultimately limit economic opportunities for tribes. And the unique legal and political status of tribal lands means that Native American producers can't always use their land as collateral to access those lines of credit in the same way that non-Native producers can. So these different policies and practices that have disenfranchised or displaced Native American communities have led to this lack of resources, which includes financial capital, to invest in their lands and communities, and has created these systemic barriers to accessing capital and credit for Native producers, limiting their ability to invest in their agricultural operations. So when it comes to investing in agricultural infrastructure, there's, like I said, still many barriers that tribal producers face, and that includes disruptions to the food supply chain, like the pandemic, or different climate-related disruptions that can exacerbate those gaps in our food systems and disproportionately impact tribal communities, because we are often in the most remote areas of our nation. Our communities are in the middle of food and credit deserts, and this illuminates a greater need for further investment in rural agricultural and infrastructure, which can be applied as solutions to these disruptions. That's why we need robust systems that serve as transportation hubs and food processing facilities, or distribution channels for agricultural products and services. And these opportunities that to develop and invest in this propose as like regional food hubs, or maybe more localized sub-hubs to advance those economic opportunities. So you can go to the next slide. And that's why at NAF we present sort of this vision of investing in these robust systems, these transportation hubs and food processing facilities and distribution channels. We know that the economic impact for agricultural production in Indian country is about $3.5 billion annually, and that's for native farm production. But what we know is that when we have investments in things like farm production, from processing and packaging and transportation, we capture more of that food dollar that stays more regional and more local. And there's a potential value of that native food and agriculture sector to reach an impact of about $45.4 billion in a potential value annually. I think that's on our next slide there. And that amount could potentially even surpass gaming as an economic opportunity for Indian country. And we know that overall, when Indian country's agriculture infrastructure is healthy, rural America's economic impact is also healthy as well. If you go forward just a couple more slides, I think the next one shows kind of just where some of the population percentages of rural Native Americans are. And you can see obviously the region, and when we're investing in tribal communities, we're also investing in rural America as well. But on the next slide, I just wanted to highlight a few resources when it comes to land management in Indian country. There are some incredible organizations out there that are doing work, and some of these are grantees of NAF, and we're proud to support their work. But one includes the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, and they help tribes and producers navigate those difficult land tenure complexities, as I mentioned earlier. There's also the Intertribal Agriculture Council. They've been around for decades and supporting Native producers through technical assistance. For example, Eloris had mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act discrimination funding program. They're helping Native producers navigate that and sort through different discrimination experiences that they've had. We also have the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative. They are sort of this law and policy entity that helps support tribes and Native producers when navigating those really complex legal issues and barriers that I mentioned earlier. And they even have their own model tribal food code. So this can be used as a free resource for tribes to utilize and use it as like a foundation to establish their own laws when it comes to agricultural like developing their own agricultural systems. You also have the Native Farm Bill Coalition, which was a historic effort among tribes and Native-led entities and also non-Native allies to come together to put forward the different priorities for Indian country in the Farm Bill. And in the 2018 Farm Bill, because of that effort, they were able to secure 63 tribal-specific provisions that had really never been done before. It's really exciting to see the effort that's been happening for this upcoming Farm Bill. It's an important year for that. I'm sure all of us are pretty entrenched in that work right now, but to see those efforts and those priorities put forward, and even including something as simple as where federal, state, and local governments are included, just adding the word "and tribes" to that is a part of that process for securing those priorities and supporting all of these other things to increase access to capital for producers that I've been speaking about. And then there's also a one resource, data resource, because there are a lot of data gaps when it comes to Indian country agriculture. And I want to shout out Village Earth and their native land information system. On this next slide, you can see that they have this really great data dashboard where you can go and see the agricultural revenue on reservations and what percentage goes to natives versus non-native farmers. You look at different native land acreage and leasing opportunities. It also assesses different environmental risks for native lands, such as drought and wildfire. So I just wanted to just shout out that really great resource there as well. There's some incredible work that's happening on the ground, but I think that kind of sums up where I'm at. I'm open to questions, and thank you for having us again. I appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Whitney. Very much appreciate your perspective, and really appreciate everyone's engagement in this important conversation. Certainly want to encourage everyone, if you have questions, this is a perfect time to put them into the chat. And we very much want to dig into some of the questions that are already there, and certainly invite and would love to get others of you to join. So I guess one of the first questions that we did receive, and Howard, it's directed to you, but I think it could be potentially open to perspectives for others. Looking at the next 15 to 20 years, given the amount of transition that we're going to have in U.S. farmland, do you see greater participation in farmland ownership by investors? And how important do you think it is this trend will be, and what will its impact be on farm productivity?
I think farmland investing really started in the late 1980s, early 1990s from an institutional perspective. And it has gotten traction in the 2000s, and it became more of an investment class. I think you will continue to see a lot of large pension funds, endowments, high net worth investors who look to diversify their portfolio into fixed income instruments like farmland that are an inflation hedge, provide a historic return that is very competitive to equities if you go back to 1930s. And they might have some perspective. They enjoy farmland just because of where they grew up or what they have known in their history, their family's history. So yes, I think it will continue to be a trend that you'll see more institutional investors come to farmland. Now, the question before that, is there any national data on farmland under a REIT? I'm guessing, David, I've thought about this because I looked at this question a few minutes ago. It's less than 20 billion. It is not a significant portion of the farmland space today. So I don't want people to think that I'm saying, oh, the institutional space is going to take over farmland ownership. It's not. But I do think it will continue to be important, and it will continue to provide needed capital to undergird farm operations. And I know with the clients we represent, David, we have 2 and 3 generation tenants on farms we manage. We do not change tenants very often. And so it is a key part of their farm operation. They take great care of the farm. The farmland owner wins, they win, and we create a win-win relationship in that operation. So I think you'll continue to see that be where things are from a farmland ownership perspective. Trend a little bit more, but I don't want people to think that's a high percentage. Your majority buyer is going to continue to be the farmer down the road.
Fantastic. Thank you, Howard. Very much appreciate that. You know, I guess I will offer up to taking, I guess the moderator's prerogative to note that the Census of Agriculture is, you know, often cited for agricultural trends and really important, but that tracks farmers and ranchers, the producers, doesn't actually track landowners. And probably the best source of information about landowners in this country is a survey that is done by the USDA Economic Research Service. The acronym is TOTAL. So for all of you keeping track on your acronym cheat sheet, that stands for the Tenure, Ownership, and Transition of Agricultural Land Survey. So that is something that is done every 10 years currently. The most recent one was in 2014, but there was national results that were provided within the total survey and specific state results only in 25 states. So I know one of the opportunities in the next Farm Bill, certainly one thing that we at the American Farmland Trust are very supportive of, is to allocate more funding to be able to have the total survey done every 5 years rather than every 10 years. So we have more current information about who actually owns agricultural land in America, and to get state-specific results for every state in the country. And this question of who owns agricultural land is an important one, and we need to have sound information so we can make good decisions. So I want to switch gears a little bit. Eloris, maybe I'll go to you, and you mentioned heirs property issues and some of the challenges that families may face. For those of us that maybe aren't familiar with heirs property issues, can you talk about what that actually means? Like, what are the challenges a family might face, and where might a family turn to get help if they're dealing with those with heirs property issues?
Okay, certainly. So heirs property occurs, if you will, when the landowner, if you will, dies intestate, you know, typically or without a will, because land transfers really through a deed or title. And if it, you know, has not transferred that way, and the landowner, you know, dies without a will, it goes to their heirs. And so the heirs have an undivided interest, if you will, in the property. And so the challenges with that, though, it hinders participation in various federal programs, you know, often. And so even making decisions sometimes, you know, related to the land and, you know, what you're going to do with the land. There have been a number in the last Farm Bill and other policies then that have allowed heirs property owners to participate in, you know, federal programs. A little bit more challenging, you know, there. And it's often referred to as cloudy or unclear title, heirs property there. And so there are challenges in trying to get title cleared. Sometimes heirs are located, you know, all over the country there. And so trying to locate all of the heirs in order to, you know, reach some agreement on what's going to happen on the land. More and more, the resources are available. Now, the laws for heirs property owners do vary by state. And so that's another challenge then, because you may be living in one state, but you have, you know, heirs property in another state, and knowing what those state laws are can be challenges as well. But the good news is that there are a number of resources available. I mentioned earlier that the Policy Center has an agreement with Farm Service Agency, and we have been doing train the trainer for land grant extension staff. And so most land grants, or I know the 1890s, the Hispanic Serving, actually provide training on heirs property to heirs property owners or even farmers, because they want to prevent future heirs properties. The Vermont Policy Law School Policy Center, Harvard, are resources on their website. They actually have started put together by state little fact sheets then. And so certainly can go to their website and access it. We are putting it on the Policy Center website so that if you're in there, you'll have links to other resources. It's also on the Southern Rural Development Center website at Mississippi State University. They have specifically heirs property resource site. There's a consortium of attorneys that are working together now across the United States. And again, that is on the website as well under the resources. Okay.
Fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Eloris. I appreciate that greatly. Whitney, maybe we'll go to you. I really appreciate your comments before, and I think for a number of our people in our audience, like helping them understand the unique dynamics that might be facing someone that is looking to get involved as a farmer and a rancher as a Native American. It's a different set of conditions. Can you talk to us maybe on a more personal level? Like if you're a Native American, you want to get into, you want to own a farm, you want to own a ranch, like what are some of the real specific challenges you might face? And I know you mentioned a number of organizations are doing important work. Can you give us some examples of like the type of support that you might look for as a Native American looking to access land?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the growth of the agricultural industry in Indian country has grown significantly. The number of Native producers are increasing. The amount of support for the next generation of Native farmers and ranchers is also increasing. Tribes are starting to develop, as I mentioned, their own tribal departments of agriculture or natural resource departments, where they're managing their the resources to support Native producers. And so to get to your question a little bit more, where I would start, I think a lot of times, especially in our tribal communities, when things are disrupted, like the pandemic or whenever, or climate-related disruptions, we saw that in a survey we did with the Food Research and Action Center and the Indigenous Food and Agriculture Initiative, that during those times of disruption, a lot of Native people turned to their tribal governments for support and assistance. And because of that, tribes, like I said, are establishing their own networks and resource banks. And that includes support for entrepreneurship opportunities. That includes programming for youth that are young and beginning farmers and ranchers, and they're wanting to, figure out how to navigate, business plans and, what are maybe the traditional connections if they want to start incorporating cultural aspects to their agricultural work as well. Entities like NAF, what we're doing, we're investing not only in our direct grants that we provide to those entities I mentioned, but we are also making investments in historic new entities. Like we, for the first time, there will now be the lending entity focused on tribal producers, and it's other financing institution. We invested $12 million to stand up that institution, Native Agriculture Financial Services, which will increase access to, and establishing lending opportunities within the farm credit system. So that is the first of its kind. We also stood up an entire entity for a tribal agricultural fellowship. So for students who are looking to, get more involved in agriculture, find more connections to, support that in their communities, anything related to agriculture that they want to study, there are opportunities like that to, improve educational access through different programs. It's a fully funded fellowship program where students can pay for their from technical vocational degrees all the way up to master's degrees. So that, that is happening more and more. You're seeing tribes invest in that. So if I were starting off, I would think about who are the producers in my community. I would look at those who have been doing this for carrying the generational knowledge, learning from them, and then turning to my tribal governments. That's where I was speaking to the importance of tribal sovereignty in the system. So hopefully that helps answer your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Whitney. I really appreciate that. Howard, maybe we'll go back to you. We've got a number of questions from some of our participants about state laws and state policies that might restrict land ownership. I know you spoke to that earlier, Howard. One of the questions is about Midwestern states having restrictions on land ownership, and noting that Illinois was one of the exceptions. Wondering if you had any insights about why that might be, or I'm curious, Howard, if you were going to be crafting if you were a state legislator for a day, and you're going to be writing a law like this, do you have any advice, or how would you approach this, and if you were involved in state government?
Yeah, I can't speak to why Iowa does and Illinois doesn't. I think the Iowa legislation goes back maybe the 1970s. It goes back quite a ways. And I think a lot of the Midwestern states enacted legislation back then for protectionism reasons. So going forward, though, if I were looking back a year ago and saying to the state of Indiana, you want to institute some kind of foreign ownership restriction, fine. Maybe you define that by excluding certain entities from certain countries. If you want to preclude certain countries, maybe you tie it to NATO, those that are allies of the United States, and allow them to invest, but not others. So you could make some restrictions specific to a country or specific to a certain, membership, I suppose. Then you've got another way to do it would be to say, we'll allow foreign ownership, but you as a foreign entity want to buy in this state, you will need to lease that farm to someone based in that state or an adjacent state. Because I think, if you got a farm on the Indiana-Illinois border, I think precluding it to just Indiana farmers would be a mistake. But you want the farming to be done locally. You want the inputs sourced locally. You want the outputs sold locally. I think one of the fears would be that a foreign country comes in and buys a large swath of land and they direct ship their output back to that country. And so you can kind of preclude that a little bit with some rules as to how it's leased, who it's leased to, and where inputs and outputs are sourced or sold. And I think you could craft, now you can get into a lot of details and you can make it very complex, or you can make it simpler. The simpler would be basically, there's some countries we just don't want to work with right now. And then you just knock those out. But I think I wouldn't do a blanket policy, no foreign ownership at all.
Thank you, Howard. It sounds like you would have a productive day as a state legislator for a day. Yeah, there you go. I guess one related thing I would note is that I think there are a couple of ways you can see public policy trying to influence land ownership. Certainly there is the regulatory side and trying to prevent certain groups from owning land. There's also the incentive-based side. And so we see a number of states enacting beginning farmer tax incentives to encourage the lease or sale of land to beginning farmers. I know there was just legislation introduced in Congress to make permanent the new FSA Land Capital Market Access Program to try to do more promotion and outreach to underserved producers in particular to help encourage them and make it easier for them to access credit and other resources to access land. So there's, I think, multiple ways of influencing who owns agricultural land in America. And I guess additionally, the tax code. Frequently conversations about the estate tax. I know there have been a number of proposals as well as potential ways to use capital gains tax standards as a way to influence land ownership and try to encourage the sale of agricultural land to people that want to farm it themselves. So I think there's a number of different policy levers that could be used here. Maybe I'll go back to Eloris, Whitney, Howard. I'll include you in this as well. Certainly the Farm Bill is on the horizon. I know each of you in different ways, you highlighted opportunities for federal policy to influence agricultural land ownership in this country. If you were going to be, if you could highlight maybe one or two key issues that you think are priorities for the Farm Bill, what would you suggest that Congress should be paying attention to? Eloris, Whitney, Howard? Who wants to go first?
Go ahead, Eloris.
All right, I'll start. So a number related to equity is where I would start. And I think I mentioned, we have some recommendations related to the land grants. The current language as it relates to the 1890 universities, which are historically Black colleges and universities or minority serving institutions, and the 1862 universities, predominantly white. For the same things, there's very different language there. So to me, as a legislator, it would be an easy enough fix then to make the language consistent then, so that the same opportunities are available regardless of the institution, if you will. That's certainly one that we're working on. Another relates to, and now this was a little tricky, and I mentioned that there are a number of minority farmers, if you will, that take exception to the term socially disadvantaged farmers and ranchers. So what we have recommended is there are already labels. So why do we need additional labels? And I mentioned just briefly not having shared cultural histories. Each of the groups has a cultural history. So Black landowners, if you will, or farmers had a history of free labor and slavery, starting there. Native American, stolen prime land. And so there are different cultural histories as the bottom line. And so my proposal is then that the resolutions should match the problems there. So build a case for action. So as opposed to lumping everybody together or all farmers of colors, say these are the recommended solutions for Black farmers. These are the recommended solutions for Native Americans, if you will, or this for Hispanic, based on what the history was and then what the desired fix is. They're not the same in all cases. There may be some overlap, and especially as it relates to land ownership. So I'll let somebody else have an opportunity. That's where I was.
You'll pass the baton. Thank you very much, Eloris.
I'll start there. Yes.
Fantastic. Whitney, Howard?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. So I think if I had to, simplify it down to, the biggest impact in the Farm Bill is, including tribal parity. And I mentioned this when it says federal, state, and local governments, including tribal governments in that. That is, just a simple language that can be added to, increase, different funding opportunities for tribes to have access to support their producers, but also tribal parity in terms of, establishing and recognizing things such as 638 authority, which is an important acknowledgement of tribal sovereignty and opens the door for tribes to make certain decisions for themselves one example being the food distribution program on Indian reservations and how that is administered to the tribal communities, but also in being able to purchase traditionally and culturally appropriate foods that Native producers have in the regional areas. So instead of having to have food that may not be culturally appropriate, to, for example, for the Pacific Northwest tribes, understanding the diversity of our regional reach to our communities, what's going to serve them in the Northwest is not going to necessarily be the same for the Southwest, and what's going to be healthy and culturally appropriate. So giving the authority of tribes to administer those different programs, that just boils down to the tribal parity. So I'm actually going to share a resource in the chat. I mentioned the Native Farm Bill Coalition. They produced this incredible report called the Gaining Ground Report, and it outlines all of Indian Country's priorities for the Farm Bill. They've done some incredible efforts to do fly-ins throughout, the beginning of this year to talk about those priorities with different representatives. So I'll share that as a resource as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah, David, I think when I think about across the entire U.S. Crop insurance and keeping the crop insurance subsidy in place, not necessarily advancing it, maybe expanding it to other crops so that we can pick up a broader all farmers, basically make it more inclusive that way. But crop insurance and keeping that subsidy where it is critical to most producers. I think you're at 85–90% of producers buy crop insurance today. It's a great lever to help a lot of people. The other thing I think is a sustainability theme. Some government tell us what is sustainable agriculture. No state or federal government has yet to define that. There's a lot of definitions. There's a lot of private definitions. There's public definitions in some cases. I think to Whitney's point, there are differences between the Pacific Northwest and the Southwest and different things that are grown there. And a lot of folks like to buy locally grown, locally produced, farmers market. And those are initiatives. It would be nice if we knew, well, this was grown sustainably, maybe ESG compliant, which gets into equity, inclusion, it gets into reducing erosion and clean water and the whole bit. And if there was some kind of legislation that defined that, then that could become a label that a end user could use, a farmer could use to enhance the value of what they're growing if they choose to grow it that way. It needs to be a voluntary program. I want to be real clear, but more investment into conservation and sustainable programming and defining what that is, I think would be helpful.
Excellent. Thank you, Howard. And I will note that there are a number of states and USDA has piloted crop insurance incentives that do link with stewardship. So if you're using cover crops, you can actually get a discount on your crop insurance premium. So there are some attempts to kind of link these. I do want to go back to you though, Howard, because I think one of the questions that that gets brought up when discussions about rented land come up is that, that some farmers feel like they can't invest in the health of the land itself and an infrastructure on that land because they don't have the security that's needed. They may have a short-term lease and they just feel like they can't do some of the practices that they might like to, or they can't make some of the investments they might want to. Can you talk to us about how we can align those farmer interests in security with a landowner's interests to ensure that rented land is well cared for?
That's a great question, David. And I said earlier in my discussion that we have multiple generation of tenants on farms that we manage under a series of one-year leases. So first step is developing a relationship with the landowner that is a long-term view. But you're right, carbon credit contracts might be 10 years and the farmer has a one-year lease. So what's the incentive? So that's a really fair question. One of the things that we've done, and we do this with some fertilizer programs like lime, where you put on lime this year and it provides benefit for 3 or 4 years. And I'm an advocate for a short-term lease because too often I have seen land ownership change, not from a sale, but generational transfer. One generation passes on, next generation inherits. And if they're subjected to a 10-year lease and 7 years remain on it, that's going to be a hindrance to maybe them selling that asset from a price standpoint. So shorter lease terms, I'm an advocate of because it gives everybody more flexibility to change the lease terms, flexibility to change for whatever reason. That being said, if I'm a producer and I want to make an investment and I want to do it sustainably, I want to do some kind of fertility program that enhances it over time, well, let's write terms in the lease that if that lease changes in two years, and this was a 5-year program, they get reimbursed something out of that. And we do that with Lyme. We do that with other programs. We've done some with irrigation even. So farmer puts on a center pivot irrigation because the landowner doesn't have the capital maybe to do that or doesn't choose to do that. Maybe the landowner gets a dry land lease rate for a period of years, 10 years. And the tenant is getting an advantage on his lease rate. And in a sense, the landowner's buying into that irrigation pivot by structuring it that way. You could do it with tile drainage. There's a whole host of CapEx like that you can do it in that way. And then there's obviously a buyout term or a buyout clause that if the farm is sold, if there's a change for some reason 5 years into a 10-year deal, the tenant's protected.
Thank you, Howard. That was super helpful. I really appreciate those thoughts. I do want to go to one of the questions in our chat, and Eloris, you might have been involved in answering this, and it comes from Natalie, and Natalie says that they are in the process of purchasing their first farm from a landowner that does not have any heirs, and asking if there are programs to help, and mentioned that you might approach trying to get financing from FSA as a part of that. And so I'm wondering, Eloris, you started to answer it in the chat, maybe you did. Do you want to just maybe verbalize what you had shared and maybe just offer any advice about where to look?
So mine was potentially starting with the local extension agent and or local FSA office then for guidance and programs. There are community-based organizations, local. I would suggest, touching base with this. And ultimately, what I put was also, even if you don't have heirs property, and you are looking to buy it, attend an heirs property workshop there. Where it talks about is estate planning, if you will. And because some don't even realize, sometimes landowners don't realize that they are setting themselves up for heirs property. And so we, in the curriculum that we develop, it's 3 parts: an overview, resolution, and prevention. And so some of the preventions are ways, and that's around, wills and how, or the types of wills and how you want to ensure that you don't, potentially end up with heirs property. So those are my suggestions.
Fantastic, Eloris. Thanks. Thanks for sharing them here with everybody verbally. Whitney or Howard, do you have any other thoughts or advice for someone that's looking to buy their first farm? Any resources or assistance you might recommend?
Well, I think she said in the question that she was looking at a beginning farmer FSA type of loan. That's a great way to do it. I think a lot of your typical ag lenders, Farm Credit was brought up earlier. But in each state, there's different ag lenders that's their niche, that's their specialty. Sure. I think here in central Indiana, we've got a credit union and we've got a local, what I would call a very local community bank, and they do a lot of ag lending. They know those beginning farmer programs in and out, and they can work with the Farm Service Agency to put those in place. And so, be it the Farm Credit System or that local bank, I would tend to talk to them and see what's available. I think Eloris said that you got the county extension. They may know of some of those folks as well. Sure. And it may be as simple as, who are the local banks in this area that do ag lending? And you just start there and say, here's what I'm trying to accomplish. Can you help me? And the FSA Beginning Farmer Program is a great way to go.
Fantastic. Whitney?
I like to add to that too. I mean, thinking about community development financial institutions, CDFIs. I know I can speak to that in Indian country. Those are the entities that we fund at NAP. But just in Indian country specifically, we look since 2018, maybe in 2021, there were about 164 agricultural loans totaling over $9 million. That were closed in 2021. So the number of the CDFIs that are specializing and doing underwriting when it comes to agricultural loans, that's increasing, and the amount of support that they have. Again, like I said, we're even seeing more investment in that, through our Native Agricultural Financial Services program, which is that OFI through the Farm Credit System, and so CDFIs will be able to participate in that and have access to more, a capital to be able to provide those loans.
Fantastic. Thank you, Whitney. I guess the one other thing I'll highlight is the American Farmland Trust operates a national service center called the Farmland Information Center. It's available to any farmer, rancher, landowner in the country. Their website is farmlandinfo.org. It has great portals to information if you're looking to access land, transfer lands. In particular, one of the specialties that we have as an organization is real knowledge and connections with the land conservation community. So public and private programs that are available to help permanently protect land for agriculture. And those tools that those programs use, agricultural conservation easements, excuse me, can be really powerful in helping to reduce the price of land so it's more affordable for a beginning farmer or rancher. And so there's great access to information about where to find those programs and those organizations from our Farmland Information Center. So again, farmlandinfo.org, and I'll put that in the chat here in a second. I guess another question maybe for all of you is, and maybe this is a little blue sky, if we were to look forward, 10 years from now, 20 years from now in this country, if you had your druthers, if you had ability to have major influence on what the landscape looks like, what does agricultural land ownership look like in America?
David, I think farmland ownership will remain largely fractured. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but I mean it's going to be very diverse and very dispersed as it is today. Farmland operations will continue to get, I'm thinking Corn Belt primarily, but you're going to see farmland operations get much larger. That is just the progression that we've been on. There'll still be family farms. I want to be clear. Most of these large operations that we see out here today are large family farms. They're not operated by some corporation. So they'll be bigger, but land ownership will still be very diverse. And I think that will continue to be the case. I don't see a lot of consolidation of land ownership occurring. And it probably will still be heavily weighted towards the farmer because they will take the lowest rate of return to own that land that adjoins them because of the way they spread their fixed cost over that land ownership. I'd like to think that you'll continue to see the next generation have the opportunity to get in, and that next generation be even beginning farmers that are, maybe they're immigrants from various countries. Maybe they are trying to get into agriculture because they have historical roots there. And that's hard with the capital today. And maybe we can help create mechanisms by which that can still happen. But that's my view, is I still think land ownership, very diverse, larger farm operations, just the natural progression that we've seen for honestly 100+ years.
Thanks, Howard. Eloris, Whitney, if you're looking in your crystal ball at what the future might look like or what you would like it to look like, either of you have thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll also add, I mean, I agree with Howard in terms of farm operations and what that looks like, but I'm coming from the tribal lens. I'm coming back to the point of tribal parity and tribal authority over those operations, but also Howard made a good point about, the next generation and beginning farmers and ranchers. So I think I would love to see, more investment from tribes in passing down that traditional knowledge to support the young people coming up in the space. But I really just want to stick to, tribal authority over different things, recognizing tribal departments of food and agriculture, and incorporating that into different administrative programs, and that could also then potentially reduce those barriers and legal complexities that tribes and their unique legal and political status of their lands that they have to deal with. When you have that recognition and tribal parity, then those barriers are reduced as well. So I think I would stick to sort of that theme.
Fantastic. Thank you, Whitney. Eloris, any thoughts about the future?
So, yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, my underscore is also equity. And so that everybody that wants the opportunity has the opportunity there. If I had my way then. Mm-hmm. So that, again, there was equity in the system and the process then. So, mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we got another question about incentives for beginning farmers, and if there's any specific types of crops that are incentivized more for beginning farmers, or any special opportunities that exist for specific types of beginning farmers. Are any of you aware of specific incentives or opportunities that are available for beginning farmers that want to produce one type of crop versus another? I can't think of any, but yeah. That's why you all are here.
I'm not either, David, but the Farm Foundation had our June meeting in Chicago. Uh-huh. And one of the cool things we got to do was go to the farmers market in Lincoln Park. Mm-hmm. Lincoln Park is in the heart of downtown Chicago. But at the farmers market, you had people doing microgreens. And the guy started in his backyard in the suburbs of Chicago.
Sure.
I think a lot of locally grown, and I'm thinking of a producer in central Indiana who they had an old farm barn. It's not functional for today's equipment, too small. What was he going to do with that? Well, he didn't want to tear it down. So he started raising some freezer beef in that barn. And so bought a few head of cattle, fed them out, basically, they were naturally grown, so to speak, not antibiotics or anything like that. And he sold it to people in his church. And it was all about the locally grown initiative. It was all about, I want to know where my food was grown. And so as I start to think about beginning producers, you can start that small and then grow it from there. And in the microgreens business, this guy now has a greenhouse. He started in his basement. Now he's gotten to grow to a much larger scale. So that can still happen today here in America. And I would encourage people to look for those kind of opportunities. And that local grown, I think, is a real initiative that a lot of people like to buy. And the farmers markets really open the door for that.
Excellent. Thanks, Howard. Eloris, Whitney, any thoughts about any special opportunities that exist for beginning farmers?
I'm not sure if I can speak specifically to that, but I would be happy to follow up.
Thank you, Whitney. Eloris, anything you want to add here?
Yeah, nothing other than like I said, NIFA's New and Beginning Farmers Program, so. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to thank Howard, Whitney, and Eloris for bringing such different, diverse perspectives to this important conversation. Agricultural land, kind of who owns it, why they're investing in it. It's incredibly important to our farm economy, to our farmers, to our farm landscape, so many things in this country. So this has been a very rich conversation. So thank you, Howard. Thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Eloris. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everyone else that has joined us here for the conversation today. And I will, I'll turn things back over to Martha.
Thank you, David. Thanks to all of our speakers for this insightful discussion today. I'd also like to thank all of you in the audience for joining us and submitting your questions. We appreciate your engagement with us. We would love to hear your feedback. So please take a moment to share your comments about today's session in the brief survey that you will see at the conclusion of this forum. If you'd like us to help us continue to provide valuable programming such as today's forum, I'll quickly remind you about becoming a friend of Farm Foundation. Check the link provided in the chat to learn more. Each and every gift to Farm Foundation strengthens our ability to address rapidly evolving issues impacting agriculture, the food system, and rural communities, and we are so grateful for your support. Thank you once again for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future event.